You know Elon? You ready to go? Rules Committee to come to order, and thank you very much for joining us this evening. We appreciate you taking time on this very busy day, a day when many of our members are stuck in traffic from airlines, lots of bad weather across the country, including ice and snow in Texas, but Oklahoma City was good, so Chairman Cole is here. Thank you very much. The Georgia route was good, and I see my colleagues on the Democratic side. Welcome. Today, the committee will be considering H.R. 4712, the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act, H.R. 3326, the World Bank Accountability Act of 2017, and H.R. 2954, the Home Mortgage Disclosure Adjustment Act. Appropriate care should be taken and given to any child who survives an attempted abortion. Any health care practitioner present, I believe, should exercise the same degree of care to preserve the life of and the health of a child as would be given to any other child that may be born. H.R. 4712 amends Title 18 of the U.S. Code to prohibit a health care practitioner from failing to exercise the proper degree of care in the case of a child who survives an abortion or an attempted abortion. Children born alive are recognized as persons under federal law, and I believe we are all obligated to protect the most vulnerable in our society. This legislation will help this issue greatly. The committee will also consider the World Bank Accountability Act of 2017, which passed out of the Financial Services Committee on a bipartisan unanimous 60-0 vote. This legislation would hold up to 30% of future appropriations for the World Bank's International Development Association until the Secretary of Treasury reports that the bank has undertaken reforms to increase accountability, combat corruption, and strengthen management effectiveness, as outlined not only in the bill but also in discussions of the committee. IDA appropriations currently face numerous problems, including lending to corrupt regimes. This legislation will help ensure these funds are used to undermine extremism, promote global stability, and aid impoverished individuals suffering under those oppressive regimes. We're delighted to have tonight former staff member of President George W. Bush from the Bush White House, and a member of my crack staff, Louise, Ilan Liang. Ms. Liang came to my staff in 1997 from the University of Virginia. Is an esteemed member of the former Texas Society, and we're delighted that she's here representing the World Bank this evening. Ilan, we're delighted that you are with us, and congratulations for your tenure at the World Bank. The committee will also be considered legislation addressing the CFPB's rule that requires financial institutions to report 25 new data fields for each borrower, more than double the statutory requirements laid out by Congress. Additional regulatory burdens affect a bank's bottom line and the consumer's access to affordable credit. Because small institutions are less able to absorb increasing regulatory costs, they are now more likely to pass the cost of regulations on to their customers. So, in the form of higher prices and diminished credit availability, they are passing these costs on, which makes it more costly to do business in the United States of America. H.R. 2954 amends the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act of 1975 to exempt from maintenance of mortgage loan records and disclosure requirements depository institutions that have originated in each of the two preceding calendar years fewer than 500 closed-end mortgage loans and fewer than 500 open lines of credit. So, to discuss these and other matters, we have a panel who is assembling tonight. We appreciate them coming. The gentleman from Kentucky, Congressman Andy Barr, as well as a gentlewoman from Wisconsin, Congresswoman Moore. We welcome them on our first panel. We're delighted to have both of you I would say this to you, you've been up to the Rules Committee, you know that we will engage you on this, but we appreciate you representing not only the committee, your ideas, but also your party and the ideas that emanate from that, and you'll be we will be well pleased to have you not only present those ideas, but to know that we're delighted that you're here. So without objection, anything you brought in writing will be entered in the record. But before we go to you, I want to yield the time as she chooses to the gentlewoman, the ranking member, Ms. Slaughter.
I have no opening statement. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Gentlewoman has no opening statement.
Andy Barr there.
Yeah, you know, he's a pretty good guy. But Gwen's doing all right, too. You know, I visited Andy in Georgetown, Kentucky.
Yes, gorgeous, beautiful town.
And it was, and I had a great time. Went to a Rotary Club meeting and did a makeup and got that done. But it is fun to be in people's homes, back where they are. And what I found is that, you know, we like him here. He's a really cool guy. They think he hung the moon there. And they really, I mean, the people were very genuine and very nice. Never seen so much green grass in my life as I saw in Kentucky.
No, it's blue.
Well, it was green to me. But it was.
We had to be there long enough, I guess.
Yeah, I guess so. It did right.
It's blue, isn't it?
It's a bluegrass state. Was it? All right, Andy, was it green the day I was there or blue? It was green with a little blue. Okay, there you go. All
You
right.
have to get up early in the morning and see.
Yeah, well, that's I need to do that too. Mr. Barr, we're delighted that both of you are here. The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Slaughter, my fellow Kentuckian. Thank you also for your service on this committee, members of the Rules Committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you all to testify on behalf of two bipartisan bills from the Financial Services Committee, H.R. 3326, the World Bank Accountability Act, and H.R. 2954, the Home Mortgage Disclosure Adjustment Act. Let me describe both. H.R. 3326, which I introduced, was reported out of the Financial Services Committee by a unanimous vote of 60-0, and it is co-sponsored by a senior Democratic member of the committee, Mr. Sherman of California. And I enjoyed working with my good friend, the ranking member from Wisconsin, Mrs. Moore, on that legislation. H.R. 3326 makes a portion of annual appropriations for the World Bank's International Development Association, IDA, contingent on the bank undertaking urgent reforms, and authorizes the Trump administration's request for a 15% reduction for IDA's current replenishment cycle. This is the first time in more than a decade that our committee has attached reforms to an authorization for the IDA, which provides assistance to the world's poorest countries. By attaching reforms to an authorization, this bill will incentivize the bank to deliver real results, not just push money out the door. One such reform included in the bill requires the bank to rectify well-documented management failures that have enabled the abuse of World Bank beneficiaries, including the tragic sexual abuse of children. And the bill calls for enhanced efforts to root out corruption in the bank's projects. In addition, the legislation safeguards national security by requiring the bank to work against violent extremism and cut off state sponsors of terrorism from assistance. Again, every member of the Financial Services Committee voted for this bill, Republican and Democrat. Having said that, some on the other side of the aisle will argue that tying taxpayer dollars to reforms, no matter how pressing those reforms are, gives them pause. I would just note that the reforms in our bill address problems that have been documented for years, and in some cases, decades, including by the World Bank itself. Moreover, imposing conditionality on the World Bank appropriations is a policy that Democrats themselves, including minority members on our committee, have endorsed. In 2005, the House passed the Foreign Operations Appropriations Bill by a vote of 393 to 32, a measure that included a 25% withholding from the World Bank contingent on procurement reforms. Ranking Member Waters and other Democrats on our committee all voted for this legislation. In fact, if you are a Democrat on the Rules Committee and served in Congress at that time, you too voted to tie the World Bank's funding to reforms. I have worked with the staff of the Treasury Department to ensure that this bill's reforms are meaningful, but that they are also achievable if the bank takes them seriously. We should all be able to unite behind this approach. H.R. 2954, which was introduced by Mr. Emmer of Minnesota, is also an important piece of legislation. It provides much-needed regulatory relief for our community banks and credit unions from onerous CFPB regulations that impede their ability to make home loans. On January 1st of this year, changes went into effect related to the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, or HMDA. These changes, which were mandated by Dodd-Frank and implemented by the CFPB, significantly expand the information that lenders are required to collect, record, and report about mortgage applications and loans. But much like many things the CFPB is involved in, the rule went far beyond what it was originally intended by Congress. To be more specific, the CFPB's updated HMDA rule now requires financial institutions to collect a total of 48 unique data fields on each mortgage loan they make. While this may seem like an innocuous number, this is more than double the number of data fields lenders were required to collect before the rule went into effect. As if adding 25 data fields wasn't enough, the CFPB rule also modified 20 of the 23 existing fields. And the cost and the complexity of compliance resulting from these changes is so great that many small banks are hesitant to be active in the mortgage business altogether. You don't have to take my word for it. A community banker in Kansas said that, quote, "As crazy as it seems, our current HMDA process includes 4 people verifying HMDA data on each loan." And that was before the changes we are discussing today. According to that same banker, doubling the number of data fields as required in the CFPB's HMDA rule, quote, "will be almost overwhelming for a bank such as ours," unquote. The CFPB's attempt to meet the needs of homeowners, potential homeowners, and neighborhoods throughout the nation should not come at the expense of small banks and credit unions providing loans to hardworking families. These institutions should spend less time and resources meeting burdensome, onerous paperwork requirements and instead have the freedom to serve their communities. This bill provides much-needed relief to these institutions, enabling them to maintain a vibrant lending market in communities nationwide. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on these 2 important bills, and I welcome your questions.
Mr. Barr, thank you very much. I appreciate this straightforward testimony. The gentlewoman from Wisconsin, Ms. Moore, we're prepared for you. You're now recognized.
Thank you so much,
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member and members of this prestigious committee. Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, it really hurts my tongue to say it, but I do want to congratulate the majority, specifically Mr. Barr, for moving this bill. I'm talking about H.R. 3326, and I think it's important that we do this work, and it really speaks well of Mr. Barr's stewardship. Any of you who would like to visit Milwaukee this time of year would be a good time to come. It's about 10 below zero there today, and I'd be happy to show you around. However, on the serious side, I think that this would be a much better bill were this body to adopt the amendment which I filed. H.R. 3326 would authorize the Secretary of the Treasury to contribute on behalf of the United States $3.29 billion over 3 years toward the 18th replenishment of the IDA, the World Bank's concessionary window that provides grants and highly concessional loans to the world's poorest countries. Now, Mr. Barr is correct that Democrats joined our Republican colleagues to favorably report this bill out of committee to show support for the bill's authorization of the $3.29 billion to the IDA replenishment. We viewed this authorization as an important marker of the United States' international engagement from a committee that has not in recent years demonstrated a great deal of interest in global economic cooperation. But to your observation, Mr. Chairman, we also made it clear that our continued support on the floor would be conditioned on the degree to which Republicans seeks to over our concerns about other provisions of the bill that we found objectionable. Specifically, the bill mandates 2 different sets of institutional and policy reforms at the World Bank that would cut up to 30% of the annual U.S. contribution to IDA in each of the successive 6 years, unless the Secretary of Treasury reports to Congress that the bank has adopted or is making steps to implement both sets of reforms outlined in the bill. Now, first of all, we don't believe that cutting U.S. funds for and diminishing the U.S. influence at the international financial institution is an effective approach to reform. We've been down this road and we've seen that that hasn't happened. Negotiations for the IDA 18 replenishment were completed in December of 2016, at which time the Obama administration made a provisional U.S. pledge equal to the amount the U.S. had pledged to each of the two most recent IDA replenishments. But in 2018 budget, the Trump administration requested a congressional authorization for the United States to participate in the IDA 18 replenishment. But as a starting point, with a 15% reduction from the amount that the Obama administration had initially pledged. So we start now with the 15% overall cut. And then that would give the administration cover to make additional cuts for the next 6 years, up to 30% each year. So we're not aware of Congress have ever adopting any legislation that authorizes U.S. participation in an IDA replenishment going all the way back to the very first one in 1964, which seeks to condition the disbursement of U.S. funds not only for the current replenishment, but for future IDA replenishments that haven't even been negotiated and in fact don't even exist. Yet, that's what this legislation would do by attaching its conditions to the current IDA 18 replenishment and the next IDA 19 replenishment as well. Now, this bill says that it does this, purports to give our Treasury Secretary flexibility. Flexibility is always kind of a squishy thing. But it does so with the maximum rigidity, Mr. Chairman, namely in a year in which the Secretary does not certify the bank's compliance with the conditions outlined in the bill. The bill gives the Secretary discretion to disperse the full U.S. appropriation that year if the Secretary has reported for 3 previous consecutive years that the bank has successfully met both sets of reforms. It's kind of talking out of both sides of the mouth. This is the only case outlined in the bill in which an appropriation that would otherwise be cut could be dispersed. This means that absent a track record of 3 consecutive years of successful reporting, any withholding of U.S. funds in a given fiscal year would actually be a permanent cut. So it's not just a withholding, a permanent cut. This means that for the first 3 years covered by the bill, meaning the entire IDA 18 replenishment, there's really no flexibility at all, since it would be impossible for the bank to establish a successful track record for 3 previous years in a row until the 4th year covered by the bill at the earliest. In case this is confusing to you, just let me say we are programming them for failure. And moreover, previous efforts to condition the disbursement of U.S. funds on the adoption of certain reforms have not always been successful. For example, in 2005, Congress included a rider in the first year of the IDA 14 replenishment that withheld 20% of the U.S. contribution until certain anti-corruption reforms were achieved. Treasury was unable to certify that the World Bank had met all the required reforms in the first year, and Congress rescinded $31.35 million in a subsequent spending bill that also stripped the withholding mandate and replaced it with the requirement that the Treasury report to Congress on the status of World Bank compliance. I'm not going to read all of this. I'm going to submit it to the record. But I just do want to make the point that reinforcing U.S. political and security objectives through economic growth job creation, and the provision of social services in countries like Ukraine, Afghanistan, and Iraq, and providing assistance that addresses the root cause of instability and promoting U.S. economic growth through exports, are all supported by this IDA replenishment, that our security interests are augmented by this replenishment. We get to respond to global crises such as the refugee crisis in the Middle East and North Africa and build countries' resilience to future crises. And so I appreciate the fact that we're moving on this important issue. I know how important and what the hard work that Mr. Barrett's put into this. But we do need to make some changes to ensure that this legislation does not end up undercutting the U.S.'s long-term strategic goals, which is exactly what my amendment does, by striking provisions that condition disbursement of IDA funds for the next 6 years and replaces it with instructions to the Secretary of Treasury to use the voice and the vote of the U.S. at the bank to promote all the policy reforms contained at in the legislation. With regard to the HMDA Disclosure Act adjustment, I'm here, unfortunately, to speak against H.R. 2954, the Home Mortgage Disclosure Adjustment Act. Now, I'm a champion of small banks and credit unions. This legislation was sold to me as a targeted relief for small mortgage lenders. I've even started a community development credit union in my past life from scratch. So I'm very interested in supporting small banks and credit unions. And this is a veneer, though. And here's why I ultimately voted against it. We're talking about whether or not lenders need to report data that is collected as part of sound underwriting practices. This is not some new thing, some arcane data that they must collect, maintain, and report. Rather, this legislation says lenders should not be reporting new HMDA data that was added under Dodd-Frank and imposed under Regulation C, since under the Consumer Bureau's discretionary rulemaking authority to effectuate the purposes under HMDA. So, in many cases, at least for closed-end mortgage loans, this information is already collected by lenders as part of their underwriting practices and compliance with federal law. TILA, RESPA, and TRID, all this information that they have to collect, that's simply, they could just plug it into their HMDA reporting. Some of the new HMDA data, the street address of the collateral property, the borrower's age, the credit score, interest rates, loan-to-value rate, and loan terms, these are not shocking, new, or unusual data points if you're making a mortgage loan. One of the important reasons Congress requires mortgage lenders to collect and report this data is to enable public and government officials to be able to monitor lending patterns and practices and to assist in compliance with fair lending laws and regulations to combat discriminatory lending. Congress expanded reporting under HMDA under Dodd-Frank and empowered the Consumer Bureau to include additional data fields. Data fields, Mr. Chairman, that are already required to be collected under federal law. It was done in part based on lessons we learned from the financial crisis about gaps in mortgage lending data and to ensure that HMDA data reflect changes to the evolving mortgage market going forward. So it's important to recognize that the Consumer Bureau uses a balancing test between the cost of complying and an industry benefit to the public and having more robust data. I can see that there's sort of an uneasiness in the room. That means I'm talking too long. I will submit my written testimony for your purview, but I am saying that here is a case where less data will be harmful to our transparency about mortgage lending. There's a lot of debate about what caused the mortgage meltdown, but I think nobody Nobody who's honest about it disagrees that there was predatory lending. Predatory lending, people didn't collect mortgagers' information, their capacity to repay, and it was less data on these borrowers that enabled the predatory lending. And so with that, I would yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Ms. Moore. At no point would this committee become exercised by what you give us. We appreciate.
But I'm a politician. I could go on and on and on.
Well, that might be true. What I want you to know is that we appreciate you being here and a strong advocate for what you believe in. That's important. The parliamentarian for the Financial Services Committee, and I spent some time as I was preparing for this, and the parliamentarian accurately included in the summary here, and it was part of what the overall hearing was about, but I would quote the Shasan Chavkin of the International Consortium of Investment Journalists testified before the Financial Services Committee as it relates to the issues that have been talked about corrupt practices. He testified as follows, and I quote, that's in this report, page 4. We found instead that the bank repeatedly funded governments that not only failed to adequately resettle communities, but in some cases were accused of human rights abuses such as rape, murder, and violent evictions associated with bank projects. We found that in several cases that the World Bank continued to bankroll these borrowers even after evidence of abuses came to light. I was not a part of the hearing. The Financial Services Committee did, but certainly as I look at what we're trying to do today, the legislation is intended to allow a further evaluation of money that would be spent on behalf of the United States taxpayer as we're attempting to help the World Bank. I am glad, quite honestly, that we're going to not just give money when we know there are abuses, but expecting them to reform themselves is more important than saying no. Taking away the money is rather punitive to me, even though we could use that as an exercise. And I think that knowing that the World Bank has employees like Ilan Liang, who represent the management of the organization, are concerned about this and will learn lessons. I'm glad that there is an evaluative process. I'm glad that the Secretary of Treasury will have a chance to work with the World Bank and make sure that the money that we're giving is adequately protected from the abuses that have contributed to the feedback that's been given. So I just want you to know, I don't view that it's necessarily one president trying to diminish America's presence, nor desire that I think we have, at least this member does, for seeing world economic conditions get better for everybody. I think that we want to see flourishing democracies. I think we want to see flourishing activity, and certainly poor countries that do the right thing should benefit also. So I want to thank both of you for being here, for not only your feedback. I have one last question. It's just a question. I asked if we had a SAP, a Statement of Administrative Policy, and one has not been presented, which is fine. But as I recall, the CFPB has a decision maker that could make many of these decisions by themselves. Have you taken time to exercise the CFPB to see if they would do this themselves before legislation, or do we believe, well, we need to be a part of this process? Because they could correct these things themselves, right?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think that they do have discretion to correct themselves in a number of things and reverse some overreaches in the past. But I think in this case, this bill is warranted because the Bureau itself went well beyond what the Dodd-Frank law even required.
Well, true, but the CFPB is now controlled by a gentleman that used to be a member of this body, and he could arbitrarily, which is what the way the legislation was written, arbitrarily take responsibility for things that are oversights and undersights. In this case, could aim at it, and I don't doubt why we should be here, because I think we should be involved, but that's not my point. We need to get this corrected. Does the new director not see that that's within his purview?
I think the new director would, but it's important, especially with this agency that has operated so frequently outside of the accountability of the Congress by design, that the Congress also make its views known, that in this case, the Bureau has overstepped its role here. And so I'm just saying here, on December 21st, Acting Director Mulvaney did announce that the CFPB does not intend to require data resubmission unless data errors are material, and they do not intend to assess penalties for errors in the data collected in 2018 and reported in 2019. So they are taking some effort to alleviate the burden from these community financial institutions. But when these community banks that are dealing with these mortgages are required now to more than double the amount of data fields and the amount of data that they're required to collect, it's frankly incentivizing these community financial institutions to exit the mortgage business altogether. How on earth does that help the people that we're trying to protect? That is not consumer protection. That's denying credit-worthy Americans access to the American dream. That is not consumer protection.
Well, it's my hope, notwithstanding what we view might be Mr. Mulvaney's ideas or decisions, that you do stay involved, and I am delighted that you've done that and that Ms. Moore's here. Once again, the parliamentarian of the Financial Services Committee has made sure that I understand why and what we're trying to do in this regard also, and it's to have congressional feedback and input. I appreciate that. She is, I think, on the right target, and I think you are too. Gentleman, Chairman Cole.
I just want to welcome both my good friends up here, two of my very best members. Always a delight to have you, but I have no questions.
Thank you very much. Ms. Slaughter?
Thank you very much, and I want to welcome you both too. Gwen's one of my very best friends, and I appreciate all the great work she does. As a matter of fact, on the mortgage part of this, I don't understand why we have such short memories. I mean, it was just not a few years ago that all those houses were underwater, and people absolutely lost them who should not have ever had those mortgages in the first place. Mm-hmm. And now we're going to say we don't want the information to keep us from giving mortgages to people who should not have them, people who don't have any way to pay for them and to keep that house. I'm going through that a second time puts us in the category of how many times you have to get hit by a 2x4. And I really am very unhappy about that. The World Bank, I'm a little concerned, I think, probably that we're doing such a penalty, but I certainly am not going to do anything to say that corruption is all right, and if it's as bad as you say it is, we should certainly make sure that it stops. But I believe I heard Gwen say, Gwen, was I wrong, that Secretary of Treasury was unable to certify whether the World Bank had met the conditions on.
Well, what I was basically saying is that it was programmed to fail because of the way the plan is structured, that if they weren't able to accomplish it within a period of time, and if they missed 1 year and weren't, even if they certified it the second year and the third year, they'd still have that cut going forward. And so, one of the things I want to point out, and I think that the chairman alluded to it in his comments when he was speaking about the World Bank, and that is that the greatest leverage we have in the World Bank is our voice and our vote. I mean, we are deep pockets. And so I was horrified when we had the hearings and heard about the rape and corruption in Uganda. But the power we had was that we got the deep pockets to make you all reform. And so the extent to which we become penny wise and pound foolish and we just start withdrawing money, that diminishes our voice, our vote. I mean, our pockets are our voice and vote. With regard to the HMDA data, I appreciate the fact that people want to get rid of a lot of paperwork, but you know, the CFPB has gotten a really bad reputation here among the majority because they've been very aggressive, and it's in returning consumer monies to them.
About $12 billion.
Yeah, 12, $13 billion. I mean, even I've been a beneficiary
I
of that.
think that's a good thing.
You know, I got a check back from a car dealer, you know, because if you got a name like Washington, for example, you're bound, you know, people, you're African American. You're not George Washington, the president. You know, a lot of black people, I guess, were real proud of George Washington. And so that came to be a name. If your name is Gonzalez or Washington or Johnson, something that's African American or Hispanic, you're going to have loans that are higher than other people named Shavinsky, even though you're just as creditworthy. And these were the kinds of things that the CFPB disclosed, the whole Wells Fargo opening up accounts, and $13 billion were returned to our constituents. And the majority has been mad at them ever since then. Now, this HMDA data, like I said in my testimony, you know, this is not new ground we're breaking. That these data are already required in other federal requirements. I do know that on December 21st, 2017, and maybe you can tell me about this, Mr. Mulvaney announced that he intended to open up the rule to reconsider the 2015 rule implementing HMDA already, right? Yes. Right. So, you know, Pandora may be already out of the box, but that's my comment.
How soon we forget.
If I may jump in on the,
Certainly.
let me talk about the issue on the World Bank first, and then I'll go to the HMDA reform bill. So the issue here is, and I agree with my good friend, Ranking Member Moore, on our subcommittee, that our voice and our vote matter substantially at the World Bank.
How much
But-
money of the World Bank's money are we responsible
Well,
for?
this IDA replenishment request is over $3.3 billion for the next 3 years. So it's a lot of taxpayer money. And the purpose of our participation in the World Bank is actually to help these impoverished countries and help these poor people. It's not to hurt them. And the problem that we've seen from the World Bank is it's not only failing to combat poverty, it's actually hurting these girls in Uganda who have been sexually exploited, where there's management failures, and the bank's own internal reports, their own review of their practices has found that many of the incentives are just to push money out the door without even measuring the results of the anti-poverty efforts, as opposed to actually measuring the results.
They're working on it.
Have you proposed restructuring?
Absolutely.
I don't,
Yeah, they are doing
That's
it.
what this bill is about. That's what this bill is about.
I
This
thought
bill
it
is
was
about-
just to
but
take
they're already
30%
doing
of
it,
their money,
Andy.
but it is a restructuring
So
plan.
this is about requiring the bank to make reforms so that these horrible events never happen again, and so that we're actually helping the people who are the beneficiaries of American taxpayer generosity. Let me just make this point. Yes, the voice and vote is important, but the voice and vote at the World Bank is not the most effective tool. The most effective tool is the replenishment. Our voice and vote has leverage and weight and influence at the World Bank because it's tied to funding. And when we say we're not just going to write a blank check, we are going to expect results in reform, in improving the results in their anti-poverty efforts, and certainly let's not have the abuses, the corruption, the supporting of governments that hurt their own people as a way to reform that institution.
And it's the Secretary of the Treasury who has the oversight? Is that what I understand?
Yes, ma'am.
And they have not been performing.
And when the Secretary of Treasury certifies to the Congress that the World Bank has undertaken and succeeded to undertake these reforms, then the World Bank gets its full replenishment under this authorization.
Representative Barr, could you just share with the committee what they have done with regard to the programs that they have put forward in those countries after the Ugandan thing, that the World Bank did come out with reforms that they are now implementing. Can you share that with the committee?
The reforms that we're requiring in the bill?
No, not in the bill, that are in code that are happening now.
Well, we want to see them actually demonstrate reforms that to prevent cases like what we saw, where we had the case of both in Uganda, the Uganda Transport Sector Development Project, an initiative that involved just basic oversight that led to the sexual exploitation of underage girls, repeated harassment of female staff, and deficient safety measures that they may have that resulted in 5 fatalities. Now, why on earth would the American taxpayer be tolerating their tax dollars supporting an institution that allows that kind of misconduct go on?
I agree with you, Representative, but
why is
you're
the
presenting
World
this
Bank
as if they're
responsible for
not
criminal
fixing it
action?
now, that they're waiting on this bill to be passed to address it. And it is not the case that they're waiting on the passage of this bill in order to address this. They're already working with the community, with raped girls that wouldn't come forward because of the cultural context. This is something that is happening now. They're not waiting on us to pass this bill before they have stepped in. The World Bank has stepped in to intervene with trying to stop this abuse. Nobody is more concerned about them stopping raping people than me.
Yeah.
And we're not waiting on this bill to pass for that to happen.
Okay.
Yeah,
I would think not, but I really have a hard time.
Right. I mean, I just, you know, and I know how committed he is, but I mean, your bill don't have to pass for them to do that.
So in order
The
to
connection between money we give them to rebuild, how does that
we
cause girls to be
we want
raped?
to eliminate the perverse. We want to eliminate the perverse incentives that prioritize the bank just pushing money out the door instead of focusing on delivering results. When we require, if our participation in the World Bank is meaningful, then we should require reforms of the World Bank. And if the World Bank does not reform itself and clean up its act in these particular cases, and I don't doubt that the World Bank does some very good things. That's why we're reauthorizing the IDA replenishment. But we're asking the bank to undertake some very basic management reforms and demonstrate to the Congress that they're doing so and to the Department of Treasury. And all they have to do is they have to demonstrate that they're making those reforms, and then they get the full complement of the replenishment that we're authorizing here. So it's really a simple account, and it's also not unprecedented. Democrats in Congress have used this very tool of conditioning replenishment based on some reforms that the World Bank undertake, and that's how we meaningfully participate in the World Bank as a country. If I could just return to the HMDA issue, the purpose of this bill is not to go back to subprime lending or the abuses or predatory lending at all.
Mightn't you do that if you don't have the proper information?
Well, the reality is there are 23 existing data fields that are required to be collected for mortgage lenders under current law. The laws in place are the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, the Fair Housing Act, the Dodd-Frank Act under the Unfair Deceptive Abuses Acts and Practices Enforcement Authority, the Community Reinvestment Act, the Civil Rights Act, the Rehabilitation Act, the Housing Community Development Act, fair housing-related presidential executive orders. None of those change. Those protections stay in place. What we're talking about here is duplicative, superfluous data collection that doesn't meaningfully provide additional material information to the regulator. And what's the result of all of this additional compliance cost for the mortgage lender? The result is this. The result is that many community banks have said that the qualified mortgage rule now stands for, or QM stands for quitting mortgages. Community financial institutions are literally exiting the business of mortgage lending. A 2014 survey by the Independent Community Bankers Association found that the regulatory burdens are preventing 73% of community banks from making more residential mortgage loans. We're not talking about making sure that there's no predatory lending. We're talking about just basic data collection that's so burdensome on a community financial institution that they literally are exiting the business altogether. Now, that does not help consumers because it means that there's restricted access to mortgage credit for credit-worthy borrowers. Because in rural communities, as you know from being from Eastern Kentucky, there's not big banks, and there's community banks, there are credit unions. If the credit union or the community bank in Southeast Kentucky picks up and leaves, or just exits mortgage lending altogether because they now have to collect double the data that they used to, then mortgages are literally no longer available to the people of that community. So we're not talking about predatory loans, we're just talking about easing the compliance costs for our community financial institutions so that creditworthy borrowers can have access to responsible mortgage credit.
All right. Thank you, I yield.
Joan yields back
Unless-
time. Thank you very much. The gentleman from Georgia, the distinguished gentleman, Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
This being 2 weeks in a row, Ms. Moore has come up here to
Hey, I'm
to
kinda like
advocate
it
on
up
behalf
here.
of
On a
folks.
roll.
We are on a roll, and on a roll doing some good things too, from tribal sovereignty last week to supporting small financial institutions this week. This is not a hypothetical that Mr. Barr is laying out. I know a bank in my community. Finally, we're getting some life back into the financial sector. Some folks got together to start a bank, and they said, Rob, we're not going to do mortgages. It's just not, it's not worth it, not just because the work is onerous, but that the penalties for not getting it right every single time were so burdensome. Now, you know, mistakes happen, and community bank, you make a mistake, you fix it, you make it right, because you're going to sit beside the fella at church on Sunday, or see him at CVS on a Friday night. You're going to make it right, but the onerous compliance costs are paired with some severe penalties. But tell me this: my understanding is that the CFPB, when it went off script and doubled the number of data points, said, hey, we recognize that this can be a burden, and so if you're offering open-end lines of credit, but you only do 100 or less in a year, you're not going to be required to comply, because we recognize how challenging it is, and that this legislation says 100, which my understanding is the small business exemption currently exempts not 5% of mortgages, not 1% of mortgages, but just over 0.3% of mortgages are exempted with the small lender exemption today, that you just want to raise that 100 open-end lines of credit a year up to 500 open-end lines of credit a year. We're still talking about a small number of folks. The data is still gonna come in, but isn't it right that the CFPB recognized there's a problem for small lenders? They set the number at 100. You want to move the number to 500, recognizing that same principle, or am I misunderstanding the legislation?
No, the gentleman is exactly right, and it's very true, and it's a good point that the gentleman from Georgia makes, that the CFPB itself recognized that doubling the amount of data fields and the amount of data that has to be collected could be a tremendous burden on a small community financial institution. What they didn't take into account, though, is that we're talking about many small institutions that originate more than 25, it's 25 closed-end loans or more than 100 open lines of credit each year. And well, all we're doing is we're just extending the CFPB's precedent to actually take into account small institutions that originate in each of the 2 preceding calendar years fewer than 500 closed-end mortgage loans and fewer than 500 open lines of credit. So in other words, extending the regulatory relief to a larger number of community banks, but still, we're not talking about massive institutions with huge numbers of originated mortgages. We're talking about fewer than 500 mortgages a year.
Ms. Moore?
Oh, thank you so much. And I appreciate your raising the issue of whether or not this is burdensome, this open-ended line of credit data is burdensome. I think Mr. Barr said it very well when he mentioned all of the agencies that require basically the same information. As I indicated in my initial statement to you, what HMDA does is sort of bring all that, this provision brings all those data into the same spot. And the CFPB noted that this open-end line of credit data that's reported could be effective in a earlier warning and better understanding of potential risks. And public-private mortgage relief programs could have much better assisted distressed owners in the aftermath of the financial crisis had we had that. I also want to just speak directly to the notion of this being burdensome to our community banks, because all of us have community banks that we're concerned about. Just want to point out that according to FDIC's data, community banks outpaced their data peers in community bank lending. It increased 8.3% in 2016. Community banks increased small loans to businesses at a rate more than twice the rate of their peers in 2016, and their annual profits were up 10%. So the notion that these additional fields that the CFPB are requiring are data that's not collected from, in a regular underwriting activity is not true. That banks are saying we're going to get out of it and we're not going to lend anymore is not true. And I just also want to point out is that way back in the day, long before I became a member of Congress, when I was out there in my blue jeans and just advocating, banks have tried to get rid of HMDA and CRA. They don't want the transparency that I think we as legislators need. It's sad but true to note human nature, that unless people are required to do the right thing, they may not necessarily do the right thing. And the home mortgage disclosures are extremely important for protecting not only those individual lenders, but to make sure we don't get back into the situation that we were in 2007.
Well, I am inspired by your bipartisanship. And in fact, we had Democratic support from the great state of Georgia, a rural state like Kentucky, on this measure as well. And so I think it would be a disservice. My ranking member mentioned it well when she said we seem to have short memories, right? Our short memory is that there was a banking crisis, but it was not a single community bank in my district that caused that crisis, not one.
No,
In fact, I would tell you that the FDIC coming in and taking over those community banks contributed to a crisis in ways that it would not have exploded without that. And so no one is saying do away with HMDA. I don't sit on the Financial Services Committee. I'm assuming no one is saying that, certainly not in this legislation. What this legislation says is we're going to require what CFPB wants from Wells Fargo. We're going to require what CFPB wants from Bank of America. We're going to require what CFPB wants from every big mortgage lender in the country, but CFPB has recognized that some mortgage lenders are too small to matter in this data, and we're going to exempt those small folks. The bill, as I understand it, was originally drafted, exempted businesses up to 2,000 mortgages a year. CFPB exempted folks up to 100 open lines of credit a year. And so this bill, as amended in committee, brought those two numbers together to say, well, let's make it 500. If 2 is too high and 100 is too low, let's make it 5. It seems like what we all came here to do, to find that common ground. I wouldn't want anybody back home who watches this debate to think that anyone is trying to take us back to the financial excesses of Wall Street banks, that in the same way that we all stand up for our communities, that we're just trying to find what that right line is to protect folks back home. And again, the bipartisan leadership that you all bring to that, I believe comforts folks back home, that they really do have good men and women on watch to protect their interests here in Washington.
And Mr. Woodall, I mean, knowing you from committee, I know that you are very interested in figuring out where those indices do meet. But I just want to point out that we don't have sufficient data on open-end lines to make assumptions about what will happen. And this is why these data have been requested. So I yield back.
Mr. Barr?
Mr. Woodall, if I could just illustrate the point that you're making, that this bill doesn't change any of the reporting requirements for large financial institutions, but there's been a bipartisan agreement within our committee, within this Congress, that there should be tailoring of regulations, and that the same compliance obligations that J.P. Morgan, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Citi, those requirements should not be placed on small community financial institutions, frankly, because they don't have the compliance staff capable of reporting. And so this is just to illustrate the point from a community banker in Vermont. small town community bank in Vermont. This is his quote, HMDA requires collection of 26 data points for every mortgage, including dates related to the application and government monitoring codes. We had 463 reportable transactions during 2016 that must be accurately reported by the end of February 2017. Of course, you have to have an internal audit of that data. The initial sample, as required by the rule, was 31 mortgage files. If more than just one error were found, the sample size increased to 60 files, and then if 7 errors were found, a full scrub of the HMDA data is required. If an application date or action taken date is off by even just a day or two, that's an error. Needless to say, we failed the error number test and commenced a full scrub of all 463 files using 12 mortgage processing and underwriting employees and taking approximately 12 full-time employee days to complete. During this time, underwriting and processing of customer transactions slowed, and the ability to work on several new product initiatives came to a standstill, including a construction perm product and a government-guaranteed mortgage product. The point is that these overkill HMDA data reporting requirements, when imposed on small banks that don't have the compliance staff of a large, systemically important institution on Wall Street, what that means is who suffers? The consumer, because the bank cannot serve the customer and the community. So all we're saying is tailor these regulations, give the small community banks in rural parts of America a break, and let them collect the data that they're capable of collecting, providing all the information to the regulators that the regulators actually need, but let the community financial institutions serve their community.
Well, I won't use any more of the committee's time. I think you're exactly right. I don't think there's a single member of this committee or on the Financial Services Committee that wants to see a community bank frustrated, as you read that one. And I think Ms. Moore's exactly right, too. We're really just not in the habit of bringing things out of financial services 60-0, as we did with the World Bank bill. We're not in the habit of saying, hey, let's find that middle ground instead of let's swing it this way or swing it that way. I just wouldn't want anybody, again, who may be tuning in here for what's going to happen tomorrow, to think that this is one of those pendulum shifts. Both of these bills represent really legitimate efforts to solve what we all would identify as problems. We're going to always disagree about where we draw that line, but I'm grateful to you all for grappling with it as you did. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Thank you very much. Mr. McGovern.
But thank you for being here. Appreciate your testimony. But in all candor, it's hard for me to believe that at this moment that this committee's occupied with dealing with the legislation you're bringing here and then an abortion bill afterwards, when there are so many things that need to be done urgently. I mean, last time I checked, the government could shut down at the end of the week. We haven't, CHIP expired in September. We need to pass a DREAM Act. We need to fund the Veterans Choice Program. I mean, we need funding for the opiate crisis. I mean, we need to deal with the caps. I mean, we need to deal with the debt limit. And, you know, and deadlines have passed and deadlines are coming up. And, you know, and here we are, you know, having this interesting conversation and then dealing with an abortion bill because I guess there's an anti-choice rally on Friday and my Republican friends need to have something to say that they did, which is going absolutely nowhere, but fine. You guys control everything. You know, the system is rigged and you've got the votes here on this committee. Just move it forward and let's get this over with. And maybe if we can get this committee over with soon and vote, then we'll have time to actually deal with some of the things that are urgent, that need immediate attention. So I no disrespect to my colleagues, who and a lot of what you said I agree with here, but this is frustrating that there is some urgent, necessary business that needs to be done, and we're here doing this. And so with that, I yield back my time.
Oh, don't yield back.
Gentleman yields back. His
Don't yield back. I want to comment. Can he get his time
Gentleman
back?
yields back. Does the gentleman wish to control more time?
No,
Gentleman yields back his time. The distinguished gentleman from Louisville, Texas, Dr. Burgess. Dr. Burgess does not take time. Judge Hastings? Yes, sir.
Support making Ms. Moore's amendment in order, and I have no question.
Thank you very much. Gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from Windsor, Colorado, the gentleman, Mr. Buck, does not seek time. Thank you very much. I want to thank this panel very much. Ms. Moore, I watched you on C-SPAN a couple of years ago when you were at your state capitol.
Uh-oh.
And, no, it was most instructive time. You got a beautiful state capitol, at least the building.
It is the most beautiful in the country.
As I recall, it was green everywhere. I don't really remember a lot more, except I do remember how great you were, and I enjoyed it very much. So, Andy, I'm still looking for you, so I hope you make it on C-SPAN sometime. Thank you very much. If you'll please remember that we had an awesome stenographer and now replacement awesome stenographer who's here, and for them to complete the record properly, they'll need anything you brought in writing to allow them to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much.
Is there any other member who would choose to give testimony about HR 2954, HR 3326? Seeing none, this now close to the hearing portion of HR 2954 and HR 3326. Committee will now welcome the gentleman, the young chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Goodlatte, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. King, to the committee. As always, we appreciate each of you in your preparation, the time that you spent to prepare yourself for the committee and present yourself. Yes, sir. We'll ask that the gentleman, Mr. King, please join this. Oh, if the gentleman would like to leave anything he brought in writing, we'll make sure that that would be entered in the record, that without any problem then. Gentlemen, welcome to the Rules Committee. If you'll please remember that anything you brought in writing will be entered in the record. The young chairman of the committee is now recognized, Mr. Goodlatte.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for allowing me to testify before the Rules Committee. Millions of people have viewed videos of representatives of the organization Planned Parenthood, which performs some 40% of all abortions each year. Those videos, recorded undercover, involve discussions of the exchange of money for the body parts of aborted babies. It also includes discussions of instances in which, during the course of an attempted abortion, a baby is born intact, quote unquote. As one doctor caught on tape said, quote, sometimes if someone delivers before we get to see them for a procedure, then the babies, are intact. But that's not what we go for, end quote. Another business executive said, quote, if you had intact cases, which we've done a lot, we sometimes ship those back to our lab in its entirety, end quote. A procurement manager says on a video, I literally had a woman come in and they'll go in the operating room and they're back out in 3 minutes, and I'm going, what's going on? It just fell out, quote unquote. And a former employee of the same company told investigators that she was shown the results of one abortion by a doctor, as she recalls, quote, this is the most gestated fetus and the closest thing to a baby I've seen, and she, the doctor, taps the heart and it starts beating. The nodes were still firing, and I don't know if that means it's technically dead or it's alive. It had a face. It wasn't completely torn up. Its nose was very pronounced. It had eyelids. Since the fetus was so intact, she said, okay, well, this is a really good fetus, and it looks like we can procure a lot from it. We're going to procure a brain. That means we're going to have to cut the head open. She takes a scissors and she makes a small incision right here at the chin and goes, I would say, maybe a little bit through the mouth. And she's like, okay, can you go the rest of the way? And so she gave me the scissors and told me that I have to cut down the middle of the face. And I can't even describe what that feels like, end quote. Congress must move immediately to protect any children born alive during the course of a failed abortion. The bill before you today is simple yet profound insofar as it might be a reflection of the nation's conscience. Its operative provisions provide that in the case of an abortion or attempted abortion that results in a child born alive, any healthcare practitioner present must exercise the same degree of professional care to preserve the life of the child as he or she would render to any other child born alive at the same gestational age. The bill also provides that the child must be immediately transported and admitted to a hospital. If a baby born alive is left to die, the penalty can be up to 5 years in jail. If the child is cut open for its body parts or some other overt act is taken, the punishment is that for first-degree murder, which can include life in prison or the death penalty. The bill requires the reporting of any known violations of its provisions. It also allows a woman to to file a civil lawsuit if her live baby was not treated with the care and respect required by the bill. Finally, under the bill, no woman upon whom an abortion has been performed can be prosecuted in any way. Babies are born alive during failed abortions. The House Judiciary Committee previously heard direct testimony by 2 grown women who, as babies, survived attempted abortions. The mother of one of them, Gianna Jessen, was advised by Planned Parenthood to have an abortion, but as Ms. Jessen testified, instead of dying, after 18 hours of being burned in my mother's womb, I was delivered alive in an abortion clinic in Los Angeles on April 6, 1977. Her medical records state clearly that she was born alive during an abortion. She continued, "Thankfully, the abortionist was not at work yet. Had he been there, he would have ended my life with strangulation, suffocation, or leaving me there to die. Instead, a nurse called an ambulance and I was rushed to a hospital. Doctors did not expect me to live. I did. I was later diagnosed with cerebral palsy, which was caused by a lack of oxygen to my brain while surviving the abortion. I was never supposed to hold my head up or walk. I do. The cerebral palsy is a great gift to me." Just think of that for a moment. Ms. Jessen says cerebral palsy is a gift to her because it came with the gift of life. She forgave her mother long ago and gives praise each day for that gift of life, which she enjoys to its fullest to this day. I urge my colleagues to support this bill on the floor so that others who survive failed abortions can have the same chance to be as thankful as Ms. Jessen. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Goodlatte, thank you very much. Mr. Nadler, welcome to the committee. We're delighted that you're gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I strongly oppose H.R. 4712, the so-called Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act. Despite what its supporters would have you believe, this legislation would do nothing to enhance protections or the quality of health care for infants born after an attempted abortion. What it would do, however, is directly interfere with a doctor's medical judgment and dictate a medical standard of care that may not be appropriate in all circumstances, and it could therefore put newborn infants' lives at greater risk. Let me say at the outset of this hearing very clearly, it has always been the law that healthcare providers cannot deliberately harm newborn infants, and that they must exercise reasonable care in their treatment of such infants. The bill's implication that providers who perform abortions routinely act in a callous or criminal manner so as to result in the infant's death is insulting and untrue. If all this bill did was to restate current law, and current law, I will remind you, says that if an infant is born alive, it must be given the proper standard of care, and not to do so could be murder, I would not be here this evening speaking against it. In fact, in 2002, I supported the Born Alive Infant Protection Act when it passed the House because it was harmless and specifically just reiterated existing laws, albeit with a lot of fancy language, but all it did really was reiterate existing laws. But this bill goes further. It would require the immediate transportation and admission of the newborn to a hospital, whether or not that is in fact medically appropriate. Failure to comply with this mandate would subject a person to criminal penalties of up to 5 years in prison. The bill assumes that members of Congress, not physicians, know the appropriate medical treatment in all circumstances when dealing with a potentially medically fragile baby. In opposing this bill, I do not oppose in any way proper medical treatment for newborn infants, whatever the circumstances of their birth. But determining the proper treatment is for medical professionals to decide, not politicians in Congress. That's why, as I said more than 17 years ago, I voted for the Born Alive Infant Protection Act. My reasoning, and the reasoning of my other pro-choice colleagues, was simple. Killing an infant who was born alive, either by an act of omission or commission, is infanticide. It was and should be and is against the law, and we saw no harm in reaffirming that fact. At the time, I noted concerns that the act could require medical professionals to provide treatment that was not mandated under existing and future standards of care. I was assured, however, by the bill's sponsors that this was not the case. I was comfortable that the bill would not affect the principle that personal and often agonizing and painful medical decisions regarding care and treatment of born alive infants should be left to parents in consultation with their physicians. Unfortunately, this legislation goes back on that promise, and in doing so, puts children's lives and health at risk. It requires doctors to immediately ensure transportation and admission of the infant to a hospital in all cases, with no regard as to whether doing so is in the best interest of the child's health and well-being. This mandate effectively overrides the case-by-case exercise of professional medical judgment by healthcare providers and replaces it with a blanket rule enforceable with criminal penalties. Such a ham-fisted approach fails to consider, for example, the fact that not every community has a hospital equipped with a neonatal intensive care unit or the resources, providers, and facilities necessary to ensure proper care for an infant. In many cases, it may be safer and more conducive to the health of the infant, particularly a medical fragile infant, to care for it where it was born rather than transporting it many miles away to a less suitable institution. But this bill assumes that Congress knows better, and it imposes a new obligation on providers that, rather than saving lives, puts infants at risk. I am sure that such a result is not what the bill's supporters intend, but all too often this is what happens when members of Congress try to dictate a physician's exercise of professional medical judgment. Perhaps if this bill had gone through regular order, we could have avoided this unfortunate situation. There has never been a committee markup or a hearing on this bill. I would have welcomed the opportunity to hear from expert witnesses on best practices and standards of care for infants. Members could have offered amendments and perfected the bill to ensure it achieves our shared goal of providing the best, most medically appropriate care to infants and their mothers. For that reason, I urge you to make Dr. Berra and Dr. Ruiz's amendment in order to remove the most dangerous language in this bill and give members of Congress the opportunity to make sure that even this bad bill will not harm infants and their mothers. There is no clear argument against Dr. Berra and Dr. Ruiz's amendment. What is the rush for bringing this bill to the floor with no changes when there is no evidence at all that doctors currently are failing to provide an appropriate level of care, and the chorus of provider groups are opposed to the bill in its current form? It seems the only rush for my colleagues is to get this bill to the floor to coincide with the presence of many anti-choice demonstrators in Washington this week. Sadly, rather than protecting infants, my Republican colleagues are putting them at greater risk in the service of politics. I cannot support H.R. 4712 because it changes current standards of practice without considering the best interests of infants and their mothers. I urge the Rules Committee to make Dr. Berra and Dr. Ruiz a simple common sense amendment in order to correct this bad bill. I would point out one other thing, which a reading of the bill indicates. If you look at page 4, there's a paragraph that says the following: intentional killing of child born alive. It's lines 7 through 12 on page 4. Whoever intentionally performs or attempts to perform an overt act that kills a child born alive described under subsection A shall be punished as under section 1111 of this title for intentionally killing or attempting to kill a human being. Now, if it simply said, whoever intentionally kills a human being shall be punished for intentionally killing a human being, it would be tautological and unobjectionable. However, what it says is whoever intentionally performs an act, an overt act. Now that intentionally goes to intentionally performs the act, not intentionally kills a child, intentionally performs an act. I think in order for a court to hold this as saying anything other than a tautology, and we don't read the law to include tautologies, the only other interpretation other than saying whoever intentionally kills a child shall be punished for killing a child, which is a total tautology. The only other reading is whoever intentionally performs an act, albeit intended to help the child, but if it turns out that that kills the child, you have a medically dangerous situation, and there's a choice between course A and course B, and the doctor, in good faith, trying to save the child's life, does act A, and it turns out he was wrong and it kills the child, he shall be guilty of murder. That's what this says. I don't think that's what it's intended to say. I don't think that's what anybody would want it to say. But again, that's what happens when you have no hearing and no markup at committee. And I certainly urge, we haven't got an amendment drafted to change this at this point, but we will get one, because I don't think we want to have something in the law that could be interpreted only as meaning someone who deliberately, intentionally performs an act with a bad medical result is assumed to have intended that bad medical result. And if that's not the meaning of the act, then of the paragraph, it has no meaning at all, because then it would simply say, whoever intentionally performs, whoever intentionally kills a child shall be punished for killing the child, which is obvious and tautological. So this is what happens when you get hastily drafted legislation that is not subject to a hearing and to a markup. and I urge you to make an amendment in order to fix this provision, which I don't think anybody intends to be interpreted as I interpreted it, and as I think a court might very well.
Mr. Snyder, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I heard the argument from both sides. I would tell you that notwithstanding a woman that felt like a procedure was being done, I feel like it's fair to have that person that was born alive not being taken care of by somebody who intended to kill you 5 minutes earlier. And I completely see why you would want to move them to another medical doctor, someone who followed the law, and someone that was not aiming necessarily to kill you just 5 minutes before. I think it makes perfect sense. While I'm not aware of the issue that you brought up of the gentlewoman who was attempted to be aborted, I've heard stories like this before, and I would think that it would only make common sense that Congress would care. I do care about this, and I'm delighted that you're here, and I thank you. The gentleman from Oklahoma.
I've got no questions. This is an issue that we litigate quite often around here, but I want to congratulate my friend, the chairman, for bringing forward what I think is a very important piece of legislation, and I look forward to a vigorous debate on the floor, because I'm sure we'll have one. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman Cole. The gentlewoman from Rochester.
This, in 2002, Jerry mentioned, the law was passed to make sure that any infant born alive is taken care of. There's no question that you're bringing this up because the Right to Life people are coming to town this week, and you want to do something for them. States have tried to do the 6 weeks abortion closure, but in every case, the Supreme Court has thrown it out. I don't know why in the world there's not another medical procedure on earth anywhere that the Congress or the legislature or the people who serve in those legislatures try to determine whether we can access a medical procedure. Imagine if you wanted to have a vasectomy and we all said, no, you can't do that in your childbearing years, and so just go forget about it. That's our decision, not yours. Try to put yourself in a woman's place sometimes. Circumstances, even in illness, you're saying that you could not help her. I want to just, I've debated this so many times since I've been here, but I do want to read a letter from an OBGYN in my district, and he writes, as a constituent, practicing obstetrician gynecologist, I am writing to express opposition to H.R. 4712, the so-called Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act. And let me also say that I'm not sure that Mr. Nadler mentioned this, but under that 2002 law, that man who was operating that awful mill in Pennsylvania, Kenneth what was his last name? Right. Is in prison for life under multiple charges that he was brought to prison under that law. So I've been a practicing OBGYN for more than 35 years. It is my life's calling to care for women across their lifespan. Throughout my career, I've cared for my patients during their highest highs and lowest low, from healthy pregnancies to devastating fetal anomalies to cancer diagnoses. I take my role as their trusted physician very seriously, and I take pride in providing compassionate, ethical care to each and every patient. H.R. 4712 would take that ability away from me, inserting politicians into the patient-physician relationship and the profoundly personal health care decisions of my patients. Like most of us, he understands that this is a private decision. Recently, I had a patient with severe HELP syndrome, a life-threatening blood pressure condition during pregnancy for which the only treatment was to deliver. This meant induction of her pre-viable fetus to save her life. As her condition deteriorated, and after consulting with her family, her spiritual leader, and several specialists, she decided to deliver. Note, she did not call in the congressman or anybody from the state legislature or the police department or anybody else. She consulted the person she thought would give her proper advice, knowing her extreme preterm infant would not survive. If enacted, H.R. 4712 would take away this family's choice of providing comfort care for the baby, put my patient's life at risk, and threaten me with criminal and civil penalties for providing appropriate and empathetic care to my patients. I've had similar situations arise in pregnancies where the membranes have ruptured too early in pregnancy, pregnancies with lethal fatal anomalies and birth defects. There are also other situations where delivery must occur for various medical reasons where the fetus may be born showing signs of life but cannot survive. The purpose of this legislation is to scare and intimidate physicians and punish them for providing abortion care. But the true impact will be on the women and families who will be denied the highest quality medical treatment that they deserve. H.R. 4712 is a dangerous bill. I urge you to protect my patients' access to care, reject this gross interference in the patient-physician relationship. I ask unanimous consent to put that and other letters opposing this bill in the record, including one from the American Congress of Obstetricians and Gynecologists and the Center for Rights. And you know,
Without objection, that'll be in
Planned Parenthood is always getting knocked in around here, but they have investigated every case that has been used against them and have proven absolutely not a single one. Enough already. Let's get back to what we're going to do about providing health care for the children of the United States, the 9 million that are about to lose it, and for the community health care centers that are about to close. Those should be more of a priority for us than to try to criminalize this and send doctors to jail. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back time. Thank you very much. Gentleman from Georgia.
No
Gentleman-
question, Mr. Chairman. I
gentleman
found
does
this
not
the
seek
most
time.
troubling
Gentleman-
testimony I've heard all session, and I appreciate Mr. Nadler's 2002 vote. I recognize that, and I'm grateful. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back time. Thank you very much. Gentleman from
Yeah,
Massachusetts.
we're in a familiar situation, no regular order, no hearings, no markup, flawed language, and I think because we have a rigged system here, you're going to have a closed rule, so there won't even be an opportunity to be able to vote yes or no on fixes, and I think that that's unfortunate. But this is not about good legislating. I think it's about politics, and especially on this subject matter, I think that's unfortunate. I yield back.
I would just tell the gentleman that this is not a rigged system. This is the Rules Committee. We are a body that meets. We hear testimony. We have an opportunity for all of us. There's no box to pass around our vote. We're open about what we do. We can express ourselves. And you might not win the vote, but it is
Yeah, I
not
think
rigged.
It's rigged in 9-4, so I don't really think we'll have an opportunity to win. getting
That's
these
not a rigged
amendments
system.
voted.
This is constitutional in every provision.
Well, can I say it's in the bag?
Well, you
That'd be a
might
better
say you might lose.
Well, in any event, I don't think we're going to have a deliberative process here, I'm sad to say. And I do think this is about politics, and I think on this subject matter, that's particularly unfortunate.
Well, that could be a true statement. I appreciate the gentleman. The gentleman from Louisville, Texas, Dr. Michael Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Chairman Goodlatte, the description you gave of the birth and then the harvesting of a brain, was that child protected by the 14th Amendment?
Not in my opinion.
And why not?
Because I think that the actions were not protected under the current law, and that's why we want to have this measure adopted to the law, which would add a new protection, new precaution. That is, as the chairman indicated, a child who was under the care of a doctor who's been basically hired to kill the child shouldn't be the doctor handling it after the child is born alive. The child should be taken to the nearest healthcare provider where the requirement is that they be kept alive. And obviously, anything that happens while they're still in that abortion clinic should also be directed in that direction. But given that concern in that circumstance and the testimony that we have heard in our committee, I think it is very appropriate to have this provision in the law, give that added protection to not just unborn children, but born alive children. They shouldn't be where they are in those circumstances.
So was there a prosecution in this case?
I don't know. No.
Well, I think, I appreciate, and we have had this discussion before, and I appreciate both of you being here. I think what you've brought to us, Mr. Goodlatte, is a reasonable approach, and I think we should consider it a reasonable request and evaluate it soberly. Yes, Mr. Nadler?
I would point out, number one, that what the bill says, that any healthcare practitioner present at the time the child is born alive shall exercise the same degree of professional skill, care, and diligence to preserve the life and health of the child as a reasonably diligent and conscientious healthcare practitioner would render to any other child born alive at the same gestational age, and that's fine, and that's current law. This changes nothing. What it changes is it adds that the child born alive must be immediately transported and admitted to a hospital. The chairman, the distinguished chairman, says, well, you wouldn't want that child to be under the care of someone who attempted to perform an abortion. Well, maybe you would, maybe you wouldn't. First of all, that's up to the, or ought to be up to the child's parents. But second of all, this bill doesn't change that. This bill says that the child must be taken to
Wait, I'm going to interrupt you there for a minute. So the child is not protected under the 14th Amendment? Someone can arbitrarily decide?
No. I didn't, no. I think, well, I'm not sure the circumstances you're talking about, so I don't know, I'm not going to answer about the 14th Amendment. A child born alive is protected under the 14th Amendment, is protected under pre-existing laws, protected under the 2002 Act, is protected under this, and nothing changes. This bill doesn't change it at all.
Case described by Chairman Goodlatte does not sound as if that child was protected under the 14th Amendment.
Well, I'd like to hear that description again, but I don't know why if he was born alive, if the child is born alive, he is protected under the 14th Amendment, period. But the comment I want to make is that the requirement that the child be transported to a hospital is not equivalent to saying he or she should not be cared for by the same doctor. That doctor may be in that hospital. In other words, the abortion practitioner may have been performing the abortion here, and if the child is born alive, he has or she has the duty under pre-existing law and under this bill to take all reasonable care as medical standards. This bill simply adds that the child must be taken to a hospital immediately. My objection to that is that it may be that it's too dangerous to transport the child. That's a medical decision to be made on the spot. It may be that you don't have a hospital with better facilities than wherever it's at within reasonable distance, and that's a local decision. And to which the chairman says...
That really strains credulity. You have a child born in a clinic facility whose goal it was to terminate the pregnancy. There's no way in the world it would be capable of caring for an infant that's that severely ill.
That is not true. It may very well be capable, but beyond that...
And you know, in my state, that they... I'm going to interrupt you again for a minute. In my state, the state legislature tried to make it a requirement that a person performing such a procedure would be required to have hospital privileges, which I thought was a good idea. And the court said, no, you cannot require them to have hospital privileges.
Well, it's a bad idea for a different reason, which I'll get to in a minute if you want to, but this bill simply says the child must be transported to a hospital, and maybe that's a good idea, and maybe it's not, but it doesn't ensure that it's cared for by anyone other, by other people in any event.
Yes, Mr. Goodlatte, you want to respond?
I thank Mr. Burgess for raising this point, and I think it's an important one because the gentleman from New York is not reading the whole phrase. The whole phrase is following the exercise of skill, care, and diligence required under subparagraph A, then ensure that the child born alive is immediately transported and admitted to a hospital. So both requirements are made here, and both requirements should be expected, but only one is expected under the law right now.
If the proper standard of care now is that the child should be transported to a hospital, that is the law now. If the proper standard of care does not, given the circumstances, mandate the child being moved to a hospital right away, this bill changes that, and I would say to the possible detriment of the health of the child.
Well, you and I would disagree because the case described by Chairman Goodlatte, clearly that child's interests, in my opinion, were not protected. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I'll yield back.
Dr. Burgess, thank you very much. The gentleman from Colorado. No question. Gentleman does not seek time. The gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Byrne. Gentleman does not seek time. The gentleman from the state of Washington, Mr. Newhouse, does not seek time. The gentleman from Windsor, Colorado. No questions. Gentleman does not seek time. Gentlemen, thank you very much. We appreciate you very much. If you'll please remember that we have Mrs. Slaughter that has added things that will be added to the record. I know you both brought, or I hope you brought things that would be in writing that would be left for awesome stenographer. It would allow her an opportunity to complete the record. Mr. Nadler, I want to thank you for taking time to be here. Chairman Goodlatte, thank you. Appreciate your time. Is there any other member that would seek to give
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
testimony? HR 4712, HR 4712. I'd like to ask the gentlewoman, the clerk, Ms. Booth, if Mr. King provided any testimony. I'd like to now, without objection, ask that his testimony, that the gentleman, Mr. King, who had to go somewhere else, that testimony be entered the record. Thank you very much, Ms. Booth. This now closes the hearing portion of HR 4712. Chair will be in receipt of a motion from the gentleman from, distinguished gentleman from Oklahoma.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant H.R. 3326, the World Bank Accountability Act of 2017, a structured rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate equally divided, controlled by the chair and the ranking minority member of the Committee on Financial Services. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule makes an order as original text for the purpose of amendment. The amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Financial Services, now printed in the bill, and provides that it shall be considered as read. Rule waives all points of order against the amendment in the nature of a substitute. Rule makes in order only those further amendments printed in Part A of the Rules Committee report. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by the member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and unopponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to the demand for division on the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendment printed in the report. The rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instruction. Section 2 of the rule provides for the consideration of H.R. 2954, Home Mortgage Disclosure Adjustment Act, under a closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Financial Services. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Financial Services, now printed in the bill, modified by the amendment printed in Part B of the Rules Committee report, shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. Finally, the rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instruction.
You've now heard the first rule from the gentleman from Oklahoma. Is there amendment or discussion?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Gentlewoman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make an order and give the necessary waivers for the amendment to H.R. 3326 by Representative Moore. Amendment number 5, which would strike the provisions that condition the disbursement of U.S. funds for the IDA on vague conditions within the bill, and would replace these provisions with instructions to the Secretary of the Treasury to use the, quote, voice and vote, end quote, of the United States at the bank to promote meaningful reforms. I recommend a yes vote.
Thank you. Discussion? I think the discussion that we had here was that there should be agreement before the money is spent. Good wishes and good, nice terms are not as powerful as getting an agreement back and seeing that it was made. So that's my feedback. Any feedback from the committee? Okay, the vote will now be on Slaughterman. Those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no.
Roll call,
Noes have it. Noes have it. Gentlewoman, ask for roll call vote. Clerk will poll the committee.
Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole? No. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall? No. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess? No. Mr. Collins? Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne? No. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Newhouse? No. Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck? No. Ms. Cheney? Ms. Slaughter?
yes.
Ms. Slaughter? Aye. Mr. McGovern? Aye. Mr. McGovern? Aye. Mr. Hastings? Mr. Hastings? Aye. Mr. Polis? Aye. Mr. Polis? Aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman? No.
Quick report the total. Excuse just a moment, please. Will the clerk please recognize that the gentleman, or I ask have the gentleman from Mr. Collins has voted?
Not recorded. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins? No.
Clerk will please read report. Thank you.
4 yeas, 8 nays.
The motion is not agreed to, not agreed to. Further amendment or discussion? Seeing none, the vote will now be on the motion from the gentleman from Oklahoma. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
Ayes have it, ayes have it.
Roll
Accordingly,
call.
the gentlewoman asks for roll call vote. Clerk will poll the committee.
Mr. Cole?
This is on your amendment,
On
sir.
my amendment, yes.
Your motion, your motion, your motion, your motion.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall? Aye. Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Collins? Aye. Sorry, Mr. Burgess? Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne, aye.
get it.
Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Newhouse, aye. Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck, aye. Ms. Cheney? Ms. Slaughter?
No.
Ms. Slaughter, no. Mr. McGovern? Mr. McGovern, no. Mr. Hastings? Mr. Hastings, no. Mr. Polis? Mr. Polis, no. Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk will report the total.
8 yeas, 4 nays.
The motion from the gentleman is agreed to. Accordingly, the gentleman, distinguished gentleman from Windsor, Colorado, Mr. Buck, will be handling this for Republicans.
Mr. Polis for
Mr. Polis will be handling
Democrats.
this for the minority. Thank you very much. Clerk, excuse me, the chairman now being received a motion from the distinguished gentleman from Oklahoma.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant H.R. 4712, the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act, a closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranked minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary. Rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the bill shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill. The rule provides 1 motion to recommit. Section 2 of the rule provides that on any legislative day during the period from January 22nd, 2018 through January 26, 2018, the journal of the proceedings of the previous day shall be considered as approved, and the chair may at any time declare the House adjourned to meet at a date and time to be announced by the chair in the declaring of the adjournment. Finally, Section 3 of the rule provides that the Speaker may appoint members to perform the duties of the chair for the duration of the period addressed by Section 2.
Now hear the motion from the gentleman from Oklahoma. Is there amendment or discussion to that? Seeing none, the vote will now be on the motion from the gentleman from Oklahoma. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
Ayes have it, ayes have it.
Roll call, please.
Gentlewoman asks for a roll call vote. Clerk will poll the committee.
Mr. Cole?
See if I can get this one right. Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins, aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne, aye. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Newhouse, aye. Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck, aye. Ms. Cheney? Ms. Slaughter?
No.
Ms. Slaughter? No. Mr. McGovern? No. Mr. McGovern? No. Mr. Hastings? Mr. Hastings, no. Mr. Polis? No. Mr. Polis, no. Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman,
Clerk will
aye.
report the total.
8 yeas, 4 nays.
The motion is agreed to. Accordingly, the gentlewoman from Wyoming, Ms. Cheney, will be handling this for Republicans.
Mr. McGovern for the Democrats.
Mr. McGovern for Democrats. Now comes the question mark, and the answer is, we have announced 2 additional hearings this week related to Article I authorities. First subcommittee hearing scheduled at 10 o'clock, 10:30 a.m. tomorrow, and the second is on Thursday at 10:30. We also expect additional hearings that will take place that are directly related to the government funding. I want to thank the committee for being here. I'd also like to recognize 2 very special guests. Chair would also like to recognize 2 very special guests who have been during this afternoon for the hearing. From the National Physicians Policy Council, we have Dr. Marion Mass from Pennsylvania, and we have Dr. Vicki Wool, who is from Idaho, who are taking time to come and speak with members of Congress about healthcare-related issues. I know I'm on their dance card tonight, and I want to thank them for taking time to come to the Rules Committee to see their favorite subcommittee chairman, Dr. Burgess, involved in the discussions that we have here this evening. Is there additional work that needs to be done by the committee? Seeing none, we've now completed our work for the day.